Thank you, thank you. I hope you'll still want to applaud at the end. I want to take you quickly to where Marcel Breuer spent the greatest number of years of his life, not in Pécs, which I had the huge privilege of visiting yesterday. It was wonderful to go on a trip to the origins of this amazing designer, but he spent over 4 decades of his career as an extremely active architect in the United States, and I want to talk to you about some aspects of that career. Can everyone hear me? Because we're not using a microphone. Yes? Of that career, and particularly in relationship to a complex problem, which is the term of brutalism, which has become something of an enormous fashion. I'm interested, and you'll hear it in the course of this lecture, parts of which I'll read to you, just to not speak for too long, because my enthusiasm is such for Breuer, we would be here until 7 this evening if I spoke freely. But I want to figure out not only how we get from the Bauhaus in Germany, where Breuer was one of the first architecture students and among an extraordinary number of Hungarians, many of them from Pécs, that went to the Bauhaus, to America, but in particular what you see, how he got from a position of sitting on air to a position of standing very stolidly on the ground in front of these incredible reinforced concrete buildings, including this Abbey Church that we'll spend some time with, where, since we're in an Institute of Technology, where we have this act of holding concrete, a big panel of concrete magically in the air, but on these very stolid supports, a kind of concrete Eiffel Tower. So we're going to follow Marcel Breuer on that trip, but first a little bit of a sideline, and I apologize because I think maybe it's somehow can we reduce the frame, because I see that the frame of the images is being cut on the edges, so you're not seeing the whole image, or something's happening weirdly. So this is a absolutely extraordinary publication by a Sao Paulo, Brazil-based historian, Ruth Verdizian, who attempted to define brutalism, and she created a box in which you can unfold maps and you can trace all of the roots of international influence of this fascination in an architecture no longer of light-framed steel and clad with glass, but of externalized skeletons of the expression of concrete. But she comes to the conclusion in the end, she says, we propose, she writes, that the term brutalism may be adequately and precisely used as long as it agreed that what is commonly referred to as brutalist in architecture is nothing more than the building's appearance. So she's sweeping away the originary claims of an ethics of building that came with the birth of the term when Rayner Banham, the British historian, first talked about brutalism as both an ethic and an aesthetics. So it is not surprising that for 4 years ago, a collector's item mega book, which you see here, has many examples, including from Hungary, Atlas of Brutalist Architecture, appeared with elaborate itineraries for brutalist tourism. So today it is completely fashionable to try to follow brutalism around the world. This was only one of a trio of lavish books, coffee table books, that the magazine Wallpaper, it's a very leading fashionable design magazine, Wallpaper magazine hailed in January 2018 as a coming of age for the once unpopular, if ubiquitous, ponderous movements of the 1960s and 1970s, in which Breuer played a very leading role. So what I'm going to try to do in the next hour is to, in a sense, explain how Breuer would be embarrassed, would find it extremely difficult to be placed into these categories. In the same month that appeared, the magazines, the very hip internet magazines, Dezeen and Curbed, if you get bored you can surf for them on your iPhones, Dezeen and Curb reported breathlessly on Wallpaper, not on their rival magazine called Wallpaper, but on a new product that you see here, in which you can turn any interior that you might own into an instant brutalist interior with this wallpaper that may be applied to your hotel room, your office, or your salon. And the Museum of Modern Art opened an exhibition for the first time, opening up an exploration of the relationship of brutalism in the height of the Cold War to the communist world of Eastern Europe, here exploring brutalism in the former Yugoslavia, at the same time as associating it with the work of the Brazil-based Lina Bobardi, I think a complete denial in a certain sense of the social content of her architecture. So what I want to do in the next hour is not, I hope, to contribute to this international flattening of a sort of stylistic agglomeration of all architecture based in the engineering explorations of the capacities of reinforced concrete, but to look at Marcel Breuer's project as a particularly distinctive one of his own invention, and one which, rather than being a denial of his earliest explorations at the Bauhaus, was in many ways a continuity. So let us return then for a moment to the Bauhaus, where Breuer was one of the first students to adopt a career in architecture, even if he never had any formal training in architecture. So you must imagine this Hungarian did not come to this school here. He was never trained in architecture or in engineering. Rather, as I saw yesterday in the gallery in Pécs, he was an extremely accomplished painter, draftsman, and then increasingly designer of things. His most famous chair here I'm juxtaposing with the incredible levitation of the Bauhaus in Dessau, not where he studied, but where later he was a master. So we might say, here he is, the young Hungarian, having by now become the youngest of all of the masters, professors at the Bauhaus, sitting on the chair of his own invention. His very first work in the studios at the Bauhaus, the so-called African chair, some perhaps not so African, maybe the textiles are a bit Hungarian in their origins, but most importantly for us, this poster that Breuer designed. For a long time I thought it was actually a poster for a real film, but we can spend a little bit of time with it. Let's see if this works. No, I don't think it does work. Called a Bauhaus film, 5 years long. It's a sort of celebration. Let's see if we get a zoom in on it. Yeah, there, that'll be better for us. Breuer, at the same time as he was designing the flexible furniture, which can be folded and moved, opening up the space of the new Bauhaus building in Dessau, where now he is not a furniture student, but leader of the furniture workshops, imagines this celebration for the Bauhaus magazine, in which he imagines a film. But the film is about not only the speeding up of photography, which is film, the creation actually of a time-based medium, but his idea that his exploration of the search for a chair of extraordinary lightness is related to the whole concept of progress. So you'll see 1921, he designs this very heavy, solid, neo-vernacular chair, which was not called by the African chair by him, but was soon dubbed the African chair, and then moving to a more traditional chair, but also with very colorful fabrics, moving into thinking of the chair as an expression of lines. And by 1925, the floating chair cantilevering himself over the air, so that the entire chair is conceived almost as a line drawn in space with tubular steel, reducing the chair from a solid, heavy object to something that can actually be picked up with one hand, and imagining what will be the next step in this unknown year, 19 ? Will be the disappearance of the chair entirely, as this young woman at the bottom is sitting on a piston of air, compressed air that comes up from the floor and can be called or summoned as desired. So we might say that between the ages of 19 and 25, Breuer had moved rapidly from an interest in the folkloric to an uncompromising devotion to the present, and even with this fictive film, to a projective futurism. So the film poster itself is absolutely fascinating. If we read the inscription in German, he says, "Every year things are getting better and better." That was a period of great optimism in the 20s. For a moment, Breuer even seemed ready to relinquish his own authorship rights, claiming that the chair was not designed as much by himself as by larger societal and industrial forces, because the poster declares, all in Bauhaus lowercase letters, that the film's author was in fact das Leben, or life, the life which demands its rights. So this is this notion that somehow our time demands the invention of the new, while Breuer, who is the cameraman, recognizes these rights, diese Rechte anerkennt. But the next step would be not as effortless as Breuer predicted. While it would not be until the 1960s that the use of hydraulic pistons in office chair design became common, it was a matter of months before Breuer was entangled in authorship disputes over his tubular steel inventions, and plagued by lengthy financial disputes over the concept of the cantilevered tubular steel chair. The paradoxes of design ingenuity in serialized production were laid bare, but Breuer remained committed to the pursuit of lightness, After he moved to Berlin in 1928, he set out to translate his aesthetic from furniture to architecture. His realized work was largely confined to interiors and to a radical proposal that you see here on the screen for an interior of total transformability and openness in the exhibition House of a Sportsman, shown at the Berlin Building Exhibition of 1931. In competition entries for larger public buildings, you see here a proposal for a hospital in Eberfelde on the outskirts of Berlin, this fascination with being able to take the heaviness of building materials and to float it over open air. This absolute fascination in cantilevering and in lightness and the pursuit of an aesthetic of lightness for modern building. Perhaps nowhere more than in his designs which were unrealized for what he hoped would be housing for the young masters of the Bauhaus. Gropius had famously built, you can see them today in Dessau, houses for the senior members of the faculty, but he forgot the assistant professors, as it were, including Marcel Breuer. And so Breuer made a proposal for a prefabricated system of houses for what he called the bambos. And as you can see, again, a lightweight, almost ephemeral volumetric box, largely glazed, glass-filled, hovering above the earth. So the sort of translation of that chair that you just saw into architectural terms. This is what he's doing as now a teacher at the Bauhaus and soon to emerge as a designer in his own right. Now, even if the tradition of making at the Bauhaus came out of the exploration of properties of materials and of an innovative training in issues of visual perception in the preliminary course, first developed by Johannes Itten, but then retooled by Breuer's fellow Hungarian László Moholy-Nagy, now a third element was announced. So I think we have to think of Breuer as someone who'd come through this Bauhaus way of dealing with materials, feeling them. They're not only their textural qualities, but how they might function, whether they're heavy, whether they're light, whether they're volumetric, whether they're enclosed. But equally, I think it's too often forgotten, that the Bauhaus, as much as it talked about industry, was not really a place of industrial production. What was nearby were the Junkers aircraft factory, and Breuer and the others went to visit it. So this was a place that was absolutely obsessed with how do you get a heavyweight thing of metal, an airplane, into the air. That is what we know to terrible effects, what Junkers was studying. But also at the Junkers aircraft factory was a great deal of experimentation in aluminum. And also in the factory production, they had aluminum tables on wheels that could be moved around. So it is quite probable that Breuer was interested by what he had seen as part of the, we might call it the factory reality, which he would turn into a factory aesthetics as he turned to the idea of a serialized furniture production. But if we extrapolate into that future, those question marks that Breuer has here, the question marks were not quite going to bring what he thought, a continued tradition, continued exploration of furniture design in Germany, connected with an architectural office that he opened, but soon world history was to take a different turn. If we extrapolate into that future, Breuer so poignantly designated with question marks on this poster, what did the future hold for this Hungarian exile, who was to wander between 1933 and 1937 from Zurich to Budapest to London and finally to Cambridge, Massachusetts in search of a career as Hitler's reign in Germany made Berlin an unsuitable home for the Jewish-born Hungarian designer. By 1938, he had settled at Harvard University and to a small joint practice side by side once again with Walter Gropius. A decade later, his fledgling practice in New York would be given a huge boast by this which you see on the screen. His choice to exhibit a model suburban house in the Museum of Modern Art Garden. So here we are in the Sculpture Garden in the Museum of Modern Art. And then a few years later, by the arrival of a whole new scale of work. So Breuer had launched himself after the Second World War as a designer of the American suburban house. This was the problem of American society. But soon things took a completely different turn as his career became that associated with very large scale, what I call in a recent book, global institutions. With these appointments simultaneously in 1953 to design two buildings that I'm going to, I hope not confuse you, because I'm going to trace these two in parallel because he's working, you have to imagine that you have Those of you who are students, you take many different courses, so you might have on the left side of your desk your work for the construction course, on the right side your work for the history course. Well, Breuer has simultaneously is designing the headquarters of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization in Paris, on the top, the Assembly Hall, and the world's largest Benedictine monastery at the time, St. John's Abbey in Minnesota. These two projects are on the drawing board at the same time, and you're going to see that they influence one another. I think you can already see it very clearly in these two slides. By the 1960s, when Breuer's New York office was at the height of its invention of new architectural approaches and types, the images of his work that circulated most widely in the press were monumental buildings, either of exposed reinforced concrete or clad in large blocks of stone, perhaps none more iconic than the Whitney Museum of American Art, 1964 to 1966, that you see here, as you can tell by the automobiles, in a period color photograph. So I'm interested in juxtaposing here the woman sitting on a column of air and this building that is made out of very heavy materials, but is in fact floating above the sidewalk, above the cars. So to me, what I want to trace, but you've already got the whole point of the lecture, I want to trace how this exploration in what some have wanted to say is Breuer's brutalism is really, to my mind, a continuation of his fascination with the invention of what I'm now calling heavy lightness. So we're moving, in a sense, from light lightness to heavy lightness. I had an embarrassing moment because I thought I had invented the term heavy lightness, but then I was rereading Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, and there's a reference in it to heavy lightness. So this is a love affair between Breuer and lightness, if you will. So let's go back to retrace a little bit the steps of this. The Whitney Museum, I must say, was described over and over in the press as a kind of fortress for art. So our question is, how did we get from floating on air to a fortress? How can one address this seeming radical reversal of the valence of metaphors, the seeming paradox of a career with a radical change of heart? I've already told you I don't believe that there is a radical change of heart. How could this architect, who had made the pursuit of lightness both the sine qua non of his personal aspirations as a designer, and in a sense of the very nature of modernity, become, in turn, in America, one of the greatest form givers of the aesthetics of weightiness, which we associate with the popularity of poured-in-place and precast concrete, and with international brutalism as it developed in the 1960s and 1970s. It would be as though Mies van der Rohe, famous for his adherence to bijna niks, nearly nothing, almost nothing, were to turn to granite cladding for his frame skyscrapers of the 1960s. So let's go back in Breuer's career for a minute. Let's start with the light and see what happens as we move progressively towards the heavy. Had it not, so we're going to move to this house, which is unfortunately, as you see, was destroyed, lost to us in World War I, arguably the first freestanding building that Breuer designed in Wiesbaden in Germany. Had it been finished just a few months earlier, the 30-year-old, Breuer's 30 years old here when this house is opened, his earliest freestanding building would no doubt have gained a place as a youthful masterwork of the international style, just then being defined by Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson in their canon-making Museum of Modern Art exhibition, catalog, and book of 1932, that very same year. Here was a lightweight, volumetric box on a frame of steel and reinforced concrete, raised up off the garden on pilotis above its sloping site in the Villa district of Wiesbaden. We were together yesterday with my new friends from the Hungarian Museum of Architecture in Pécs, and we went to the Villa district, and we saw modernist buildings from just a few years later. So this kind of transformation of Central European villa districts into these experiments in lightweight international style architecture. The house, of course, embodied Le Corbusier's 5 points of a new architecture, revealing the impact a short stint in Paris between Breuer's time at the Weimar Bauhaus as a student and his return to Dessau as a teacher had had on him, as well as, of course, on the Waisenhof-Siedlung in 1927, when both Le Corbusier and Breuer were present on that site. Even more striking in the Harnessmacher's house cultivation of sharp contrasts is the legacy of the Bauhaus preliminary course, in which students were sensitized to developing a kind of a fascination with contrasting textures, contrasting materials, contrasting forms, and even gestalt patterns for perception, to develop an approach to making which was freed of neoclassical composition, relying instead on the physicality of making. Look at the deliberate juxtaposition of the two ends that are opened up to the suggestion of a volumetric enclosure, and then the actual enclosure of this white box. Breuer's marked taste for strong contrast between open and closed, grounded and projected, or even levitating, between parallel and perpendicular, between glazed and open, all are prominent, even if the material diversity he would later cultivate had yet to triumph over the purity of white, at least to judge by the handful of black and white photographs that survive of this house. By 1934, this is, so as I was saying, it could have easily entered here had it just been finished a year or two earlier. There you get some of that sense of lightness excavated above the garden. But if we zoom out on this house too, this fascination with juxtaposing this freestone field wall that's making the site with the smooth textures of the house. By 1934, Breuer had developed an intellectual position to sustain his artistic explorations, one in which his interest in contrasts was extended from the autonomous artwork to the stakes of modernizing life, something no doubt set in motion by his own rootlessness. This is an extraordinary moment. You have to imagine Breuer's trying to think, where can I settle down in this terrible period in world history, as the rising threat of the Nazi regime led him to depart Germany, first for an extended tour through Morocco, Spain, and Greece, where he focused especially on traditional architecture in villages. This is a recurrent theme, his interest in traditional architecture, somewhat surprising. Some years ago, I wrote an essay on precisely this fascination with introducing gradually stone walls into these very lightweight boxes. So a playing of opposites that's now not only between materials, that which is load-bearing against that which is almost simply space enclosing, but also some qualities of the textures of traditional farmhouses, of vernacular buildings, into an ever richer collage of effects. So I think we see that most prominently here in 1936. Breuer has now decided that his future will be, along with a number of others, Moholy-Nagy, Gropius, and others in Britain. Here, Breuer's first realized work in Britain, a temporary pavilion, a display pavilion for a furniture manufacturer, the Gaines Pavilion, for the Bristol Agricultural Fair of 1936. This was more than a simple following of the rise of interest in the vernacular in the contemporary work of Le Corbusier, as in the Villa Mandrot. There's Corbusier, comparison of Breuer saw this on his bike tour with Herbert Bayer. He biked up to the house. He noticed that the roof leaked. He writes about it in a letter to Isa Gropius. And then just a few years later, this is what he introduces in England in that pavilion. There you see the pan of it. He's beginning also to be interested in how a curved stone wall might act in terms of support as an even more dynamic member. Decades later, in 1972, in an interview with István Kardos, I suppose I should say Kardos István, for Hungarian television, I guess this was probably in conjunction with some of Breuer's return visits to his native Hungary, he would tell the journalists that he was interested in farmhouse architectures, notably what he calls the old traditional farm buildings of the Arabs and Berbers, something he repeated over and over again as he explained to historians that his work was based in an authentic expression that Bauhaus method could share with unauthored barns and farmhouse architecture. So this is a very complicated concept. To his mind, modern architecture was not copying anything and therefore was almost like modern farmhouse architecture. The farmer didn't copy something, he made the house that he needed. The modern architect makes something that he needs. So for him, there is a kind of family relationship between anonymous, unauthored buildings that he might see in the countryside, whether it be in the south of Hungary, where he's from, or whether it be on these trips to Morocco, Greece, and other places. We're going to see in a moment how he soon imagines that in architecture he encounters in America with the most modern of materials. So this collaging for him is more than simply a material experiment. It has to do with some relationship between what he thinks of the primordial authenticity and modern life. And of course, the question of what does modern life means is very vexed in the 1930s as the political situation. Hitler has closed the Bauhaus. He's staged these exhibitions of degenerate art. There's a whole politics of what does it mean to be modern now in the 1930s, quite different from the 1920s. And Breuer finally, he's not a person who liked to speak much, he gives a speech in 1934 before the Werkbund in Switzerland called Wo stehen wir? Where are we? Where do we stand? Which he had printed in the back of his first monograph in 1962 in the United States. So this is still for him a very important position. And he made it clear there what for him was at stake. Modern architects have a natural affinity with the authenticity that speaks to the traveler, he says, who finds a native tradition. Quote, places where the daily activity of the population has remained unchanged. It's a very poignant phrase in 1934 where everything is changing. He explains, even while acknowledging that there are fewer and these type of places are fewer and further between than in the past, and thus that the imitation of such building patterns is not only out of the question, but ethically and politically untenable. And he says, the modern world has no tradition for its 8-hour day, its electric light, its central heating, its water supply, its liners, or for any of its technical methods. One can roundly damn the whole of our age. One can commiserate with or dissociate oneself from it, or hope to transform the men and women who have lost their mental equilibrium in the vortex of modern life. But I do not believe that to decorate homes with traditional gables and dormers helps these people in the least. On the contrary, this only widens the gulf between appearance and reality and removes them still further from that ideal equilibrium which is or should be the ultimate object of all thought and action. Now that might be a little bit complex for you, but let me interpret what he's getting at here. We're in the middle of the 1930s where there's essentially, particularly in Germany that he's just left behind, but I think in many other places, probably in Hungary as well, a debate between modernists who want to invent the new and those who want to insist that for political reasons one must build in the traditional style. So he's saying, I embrace the traditional, but I don't want to copy it. I have no nostalgia for the past. I simply want to learn from what I think is another language of authenticity. And then he goes further and is condemning the position of neo-traditionalism by saying it only gives people an illusion that we can return to a simpler world. We need to find the connection between the realities of modern technological society and these authentic values. So this is the position that he's tracing for himself at that moment. All neo-traditionalisms then for him are firmly rejected. Breuer's fascination with new technologies and new materials, including even working with sandblasted glass, as in these extraordinary windows that he creates for an installation in Paris in 1930, all were aimed at reconciling progress and tradition, or for the very least bringing them into a meaningful dialogue. So let's follow him to America. Here's Walter Gropius at Harvard in front of a mural by Miro. From 1937, when Breuer arrived in America, until 1946, when he left New England, when he left Boston for New York City, Breuer had been based at Harvard and teaching and practicing architecture in and around Cambridge in collaboration with his old teacher Gropius. There, Breuer's interest in developing a dialogue between the modern expression of new materials, such as steel and glass, new techniques such as steel frame construction and cantilevered spaces, and new experiences such as transparency and changing views, with, surprisingly enough, with vernacular tradition, notably with fieldstone walls, and ultimately even with the experimental adaptations of American wooden or timber construction, notably of something we'll see in a moment, the timber balloon frame, took on a new intensity. Soon, much of his attention was focused on aluminum until it became too expensive and rare during the war. So here you see Breuer moving in materials as the war makes metal more and more inaccessible. Aluminum furniture designed in Switzerland, and then this wooden furniture that he designed first in England and then took with him to the United States. Now the English were not so open to Breuer's invention. This is a cartoon of a very fashionable group of people in Britain arriving to a kind of parody of a Breuer dining set. Even the maid doesn't know, how do I set the table here? So in many ways, Breuer felt that England was not nearly as conducive to his experiments, although during that period he designed a whole series of projects, many of them unbuilt, that put together the technology of steel construction with load-bearing walls. This is an unbuilt project for a ski hotel in the Austrian Alps in 1936. By a year later, that would be an impossibility. But this experiment continues in his own earliest work in the United States. Scarcely arrived, he is given money by a patron of the School of Architecture at Harvard to build a house for himself, and he builds this house where he lived for about 10 years in 1938, 1939. And here you see, as though he's taken the Harnismacher house from Wiesbaden, these almost weightless white cubic volumes with windows that stretch wall to wall so that we can see that, that it is not the wall that we see that is sustaining the building, with a curved fieldstone wall of the type that he could see all over New England. If any of you have a chance to travel in rural New England, you'll see everywhere piles of stone walls defining fields. These fascinated Breuer and Gropius as the American vernacular tradition, and soon he was taking it over into construction for clients. This is the Haggerty House, which still stands. It was one of the earliest products of this collaboration between Gropius and Breuer. This is on the seaside, on the ocean front, south of Boston, at a place called Cohasset. You can see the house cantilevers off of its base. Again, one of these porches, like in the house in Wiesbaden, that is incredibly open, but the whole thing set against, as in his own house, you see these stone walls, and there's the Cohasset house with its supporting stone walls, playing off against now what has happened in these two houses. This is his own, and this the house at Cohasset. I hope you can make it out. My slides are not as crisp as I would like, but the is a wooden box, so it's a wooden frame inside clad with wooden members. In traditional American wooden architecture, the wooden members go horizontally across. They're nailed horizontally across and they flap over one another. He wants that to be tauter, like a volume, so instead of it being a concrete house like in Wiesbaden or stuccoed, instead he turns the timber of American construction vertically. So even in the smallest detail, he thinks, what is American tradition? It's what we call clapboard construction like this. I'm going to turn it, instead of having it overlap, I'm going to turn it vertically and make it very volumetric, so it's an even more pronounced contrast with the exposed freestanding wall at the end. This picture is significant for us there because this is a model of that same house, which is in the Bauhaus exhibition that he and Gropius and Herbert Bayer stage at the Museum of Modern Art in 1938. This is a very poignant moment. The Bauhaus had been closed 5 years earlier by Nazi stormtroopers. What did it mean to exhibit the Bauhaus in New York in 1938? For one, it was a retort to Hitler. So basically the Bauhaus has arrived in America. America, the land of the home and the free. We can argue about that, but that's what the political significance of this is. But what is this building doing there? This was not built at the Bauhaus. This is announcing the Bauhaus is alive and well in Cambridge, Massachusetts with the emigres and will be continued. In fact, schools are being set up. Here's some other photographs of the Harnismacher house. During these same years at Harvard, Walter Gropius had invited the Swiss protagonist of modernist art historian Siegfried Giedion to come and join the school where Breuer was a teacher. Breuer was assembling, actually, interestingly, a museum for the students' materials. So it was going to be a kind of display, long gone. That was one of his assignments. But at the same time, Siegfried Giedion was giving a lecture series which became this incredibly influential book, Space, Time, and Architecture, in which he incorporated an entire chapter on the invention of the roots of modern expression in American vernacular construction. And he begins to celebrate what he calls the anonymous product of the balloon frame. And this is what you see. This is an illustration from the book, but these are also lectures given before the students in a hall like this, and before Breuer and Gropius, in which Siegfried Giedion explained American architecture already has the technological capacity to invent something radically new, and in timber through the balloon frame. The balloon frame did two things. One, it standardized the elements of architecture, so it was like a early form of prefabrication. And the other, it allowed the frame of the building to go up completely in a very short period of time before it was enclosed. And soon, this house is co-signed Gropius and Breuer, but I, like many others, believe that the house was actually designed by Breuer. This is, I think, his first American masterpiece. And this is a little weekend cottage on a river outside of Boston, in which he is reinterpreting the idea of the balloon frame into a modernist aesthetic. So the balloon frame doesn't cantilever out over space. It's almost like that chair. You see how the upper floor of this little building proceeds out almost 2.5 meters beyond the stone wall. It's floating in space, but it's anchored with this stone, this incredible porch, which likewise cantilevers beyond its last support. Most fascinating here is you can say, okay, it's the balloon frame again, clad in wood, but now the wood is left unpainted and it's vertical. But the most extraordinary thing about it, if we pay attention to that staircase down there where the wood is going in the other direction, and if we look at the construction details, Breuer is making it out of 3 pieces of wood, one vertical in the main part, horizontal in the interior of the house, and diagonal in between. He's basically taking the idea of plywood, which is how do you make thin wood stronger by different orientations of the strains of the wood to create a kind of large-scale version, constructional version of plywood. One of the things that's most interesting for this is he begins to refer to this as turning wood into reinforced concrete. So he's thinking about how do I make wood act differently. And so I think that material experimentation is absolutely fascinating, and it is, once again, if you want to go do something else outside or on your iPad at this moment, you've got the point of the lecture. He is beginning to think of how he can turn wood to make it act in a certain sense with the strength of concrete, all the while being extremely lightweight. There you see how those same boards become their vertical on the exterior here, and they go to horizontal on the interior. There's an intervening diagonal thing. He really wants to take this experiment very far. When he has a big fight with Gropius, he moves to New York. He sets up his own architectural office. In 1947, he buys a house for his young family out in the countryside at a place called New Canaan, which becomes a great center of architectural experimentation. And he experiments so radically that he thinks that he can take this system of a 3-ply wooden construction and basically make an enormous space truss for his own house, cantilevering it out, projecting it out on all 4 sides above the cinder block base. And in order to dramatize this is the Bauhaus preliminary course goes to America. Look at how he builds a stone wall below, which is really not necessary at all. It's meant to visually give you the sense, this house is floating. Look what a stone wall did. Look at how this house floats above it. Breuer has invented a kind of levitating architecture. Unfortunately, he really pushed it a little bit too far because he's cantilevering that terrace off of the main box, holding it with a guy wire. You see that wire coming down, trying to hold it in tension? It didn't work. He was away interviewing to be the dean of the School of Architecture in Buenos Aires. His young assistant sent a telegram. It's about to collapse. The thing started to go. And so if you go there today, there's the demonstration of how the frame is being transformed. There, Breuer and his young wife, Connie, on the terrace. I didn't bring the incriminating evidence, but if you go there today, what they had to do at the last minute was to build that stone wall up until it hit the terrace and held it in place. So the experiment taken maybe just a step too far, but Breuer was not giving up. This is, again, a kind of question mark, where are we going in the future? He began to think, can I take this and industrialize this? Can I serialize this? Can I make this into something that everybody can have, not only an architect who's starting to have some revenue? Here he was already, before he left Harvard with the students, designing a prefabricated house based on turning American timber construction into a repeatable module. And I like this model that the students made with him in class, what he called the Plas 2-point house. Plas 2 because it sits on 2 points. The whole house is sitting like this. He thinks, how can I make a prefabricated house that could be anywhere? You know, it could be in the flat of Pécs, of Budapest. It could be up on the hills of Buda, anywhere. The problem with a prefabricated house is that it wants a nice flat site. This one can go anywhere. But what is the thinking? The thinking is actually looking at airplane wings and thinking how airplane wings are designed to create an inhabitable space between those 2 trusses, one reversed from the other, and the whole then will be clad with this system in which he's going to use a brand new plastic product by the Monsanto company to make the plywood even more rigid in its working. Here's one of his drawings. He even imagines that the house might be delivered to its site by a kind of bulldozer. And here it is in the product advertisement by Monsanto. So how do we get from those experiments to this? In the early 1950s, Breuer's career took a distinctively different turn, a move not only from New England to New York, as we've seen, as New York was emerging as a kind of world capital, particularly with the construction during the Breuer's very first years in Manhattan, right after the war, of the United Nations complex, but also a shift of his architectural office from a small architectural studio concerned largely with individual house clients to a growing partnership of architects working on whole complexes of buildings, campuses really. Two unexpectedly ambitious commissions came his way in 1952, 1953, which I've already evoked the last time we saw this contrast. One to build the largest Benedictine abbey in the world, the other to build a second complex of buildings for the United Nations, this time in Paris, UNESCO. These were to catapult Breuer into a whole new mode of practice. Almost overnight, he became one of a new type of American architects, emerging in the 1950s, a global designer, and an architect of institutional identities. With these commissions, Breuer's relationship to engineering, to materials, and to a new visual balance between heavy and light was catalyzed. As the two projects developed in the early 50s in close juxtaposition, even in tandem, these two idealist and ideologically charged institutions of supernatural governance afforded unprecedented opportunities to give form to recent calls for a new monumentality. This is a big theme after the war. A new monumentality would not betray modernism's original fear of empty symbols and of historical rhetoric, even as architects sought to counter a perceived loss of community, a perceived psychological crisis. This was the call already formulated during the war, 1943, by Siegfried Giedion, José Luis Serres, and the exiled French painter Ferdinand Léger in America when they published the manifesto 9 Points on a New Monumentality. Now, monumentality was meant, the modern movement was against the idea of monumentality. It saw it as neoclassical, maybe even fascist, as nostalgic. And now this notion, how could modernism itself not only take on the monumental and declare values for a post-war world, but how might modernism help create a sense of community for rebuilding the world? Be interesting to think to what extent after 1945 this new monumentality had its contrasting interpretations in the communist world and in the West, but in any case, Breuer's interpretation is how to create that for the West, both in Paris and on American shores. So here is the argument about the new monumentality taking place. Breuer had kind of ready answers at hand because this extraordinary project he had designed during his years in Britain, he had imagined an entire new city made out of concrete. And as you can see, there's no commissioner for this. This is just a experimental project. He is defining all of the building types that might be built out of concrete, but all of the different ways you can use concrete. This is almost and a really interesting thing to do is to take a book with all of Breuer's projects, take this photograph of this model, and see how, it'll give you hope for your student portfolios, see how almost every one of these imagined buildings he will use at some point, sometimes 20, 30, or even more years later. For instance, that project in the middle, you see that little squiggly building, which he imagines here, he actually realized during his short trip to Argentina while his house was under construction in this dance pavilion, now on a state of ruinous disrepair in Argentina. But even the kind of Y-shaped buildings here are going to go into the solution of the Secretariat at UNESCO. So what I'm going to do now is move rather more quickly than I had originally planned through this juxtaposition of UNESCO and of the Abbey at Collegeville to show you how he's beginning to play with these themes that are announced here, but finding a form from them now, working directly with an engineer. So one of the things that also becomes interesting in this career after 1950s is the collaboration with a set of extremely innovative engineers. That's something we began to do in this book that I published a few years ago collectively, in which we also invited engineer and a historian of engineering to think about. It's one of the prejudices, I don't know if my architectural history friends here agree, that we often have in looking at post-war architecture is not looking at what is the relationship between the architect and the engineer. And Breuer, over and over again, working with extremely innovative engineers. In these two projects that we'll look at with the Italian, Pierluigi Nervi, but many of his other projects with, as was often the case during his career in New York, with a Hungarian collaborator. In the office of Paul Weidlinger, was a major structural engineer in New York in the post-war period. That too is a whole interesting theme, would be to look at this kind of cohesion of Hungarian emigres in the New York architectural scene and engineering scene in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. So here we have the commission in Paris. This is the team of Breuer, of Pierluigi Nervi, the engineer, and of a very young French architect, Bernard Zerfus, who will define this complex of buildings. I particularly like this group portrait because it's almost as though they're saying that UNESCO, the fourth architect here is Gustave Eiffel, with the Eiffel Tower behind, but they're also, in a sense, declaring a relationship between this architectural experiment and the great willingness of 19th century engineering on the skyline of Paris. You see it also in the construction photograph of the Secretariat there. The very first building complex, which was refused, was for a different site, but you see Breuer here experimenting with the idea of, can I take a slab of an office building that will be a frame structure, very substantially glazed, and raise it off the ground, now not on Corbusier's old form of pilotis, but on Corbusier's post-war pilotis that are these vigorous concrete supports, in this case in a Y form. The actual design probably comes from his contemporary looking at the work of Niemeyer in Brasilia. You see the closeness of that design to Niemeyer's American Hospital in Rio, or this pupil of Corbusier in Columbia. So there's a whole group of people who were looking at this idea of the vigorously expressive concrete interpretation of the pilotis for this heaviness, lifting lightness into air, if you will. So Nervi is going to bring the whole expertise. Look at the aesthetic of Nervi already in the 30s with this extraordinary vault that then meets these piers. Zerfus is going to go on and develop all of that in a whole career of thin shell masonry. Here the Canite built just afterwards. So this is the team that are working together in Paris. At about the same time, Breuer gets a commission which is going to essentially end the commission of the small American house, the work in timber, for a monastery in Collegeville, Minnesota, in the middle of nowhere on the lakes of Minnesota. You see a university that had been founded largely by Bavarian monks in the middle of the 19th century, and they didn't want to leave Bavaria behind, so they had a kind of neo-Romanesque vocabulary. This is an extraordinary moment where these Benedictine monks want to not only expand, but to create something new. This is another whole subject. The Benedictines are exploring architectural modernity. This is a prototype, I think, for Breuer's work, which is Antonin Raymond, the Czech emigre architect here building in Tokyo for the Benedictines. This was actually commissioned by the people who were going to turn to commission Breuer. There you see this extraordinary folded plate reinforced construction with light pouring into the building. Here's the team. Here is Breuer arriving to meet the monks in Collegeville. It was a competition. They invited 10 different architects to come and discuss with them. They liked best what Breuer had to say to them. He told them all sorts of fascinating things. One, he told them that he didn't see why it would not be possible to build buildings as important as Gothic cathedrals, but with the materials of our time. The monks at Collegeville were the leaders in the liturgical movement that led to Vatican II, and I think ultimately the openness of these monks to rethinking how the Catholic ceremonies took place, Catholic theology, and to Breuer came together. Interestingly, Breuer, who we know was born from a Jewish family in Pécs, when they asked him what his religion was, because they're thinking, what are we going to do with this Hungarian who's going to build our Catholic Church? What practice are you? He said he was Lutheran, but that he really didn't believe in any faith, but he liked the way that they came together as a community. And they said he was the only person of the 10 architects who came. They found most of the architects arrogant. They thought that Breuer was someone who knew how to listen to them and was in a conversation with them. And they said that what they especially liked about Breuer, unlike me commanding this room today, is that Breuer only spoke when he had something to say. He didn't speak all the time, and therefore he understood the role of silence and of reflection in the Catholic tradition. Nonetheless, we're going to skip over that, they were willing to let this person who was designing for UNESCO, and the reason you're going back and forth now with UNESCO is that Breuer is going to say, in order to create a church for you that can take my experiments with reinforced concrete, my pursuit of heavy lightness, and my thinking of the role of light in defining a church architecture, the only way that I am going to be able to achieve this is if I bring my engineering friend Nervi along with me from me to Paris. So Nervi, who had worked with Breuer to lift the Secretariat up on these incredible piers that create a kind of almost colonnade agora as you move under and through the buildings in Paris. Nervi, who had created the entrances to the building as a set piece of brand new engineering. You'll see how if you go to UNESCO, none of the entrances are alike because Nervi is showing off everything that concrete can do. So kind of almost a museum of reinforced concrete effects, of floating the heavy into air. Obviously, Breuer was absolutely fascinated by this. Much of Breuer's later career will come out of looking at these little buildings of Nervi's and trying to affect them themselves. Nervi played off the glass and steel construction of the Secretariat with its great glazing and even the use of glass as sunscreens on the left against the solid, obviously closed form of the Great Assembly Hall, which has 2 auditoria in it, but achieves its ability to span an extremely wide space. If we go back to, you can see it over here on the right, by that entire span with no internal supports, by this experiment in folded plate concrete. So these hollow boxes of folded plate concrete, which change in form but also taper towards the top, are the willingness to express an engineering solution and find architectural form for it and create these absolutely extraordinary open spaces under these folded trusses. And I think you can see where this is going. That assembly hall is going to become the inspiration for thinking of how to create an enormous volume for a church on completely new principles of what will be the relationship between the congregation, the monks as an assembly, and the altar inside this church. The number of piers is increased from 10 at UNESCO to 12. We need 12 apostles, of course, so we're going to have 12 piers. The space is going to be treated differently, and because it's a church, it will be clad in a very beautiful stone on the exterior, but also to tell us that the church is made of the new engineering material of all of the capacity of what concrete can do. If Nervi makes these little pavilions, Breuer says, I'm not going to have a bell tower, I'm not going to have something copied from the Romanesque. I am going to lift concrete in the air and then pierce it with the bells and the cross that are needed. Also has a problem that the church faces actually in the wrong direction, faces north. So in order to get light in, he uses this as a reflective thing into the glass facade, which we'll see in a moment. So Breuer is going to take all those experiments in a whole series of churches. This is a later one, which is an extraordinary experiment in a hyperparaboid, I can't even pronounce it, but anyway, geometry, into Grand Coulee Dam, into all sorts of projects, and I think you see that relationship developing. Here are some of the others that competed. Let's go full ahead. And the thing that I find most extraordinary in this building is that Breuer thinks, how does a Gothic or Romanesque cathedral work? It raises these vaults toward the sky to bring the light in from above. He actually reverses the whole formula. Look how he carries those folded plate concrete piers up on an enormous beam in order that he can bring the lighting of the church down to the level so that when you're in it, you look out into the gardens on either side, which are enclosed by freestone walls, at the same time as the whole space is channeling our vision towards the choir and towards the altar. So I think you get there that back and forth relationship between the two. And from that, Breuer is going to go on to a whole series of experiments as he essentially completely reinvents his architectural language in America, using reinforced concrete, using engineering calculations, but all of which I believe to create a maintenance of the idea of modern lightness into a new expressive form. So for years to come, Nervi and Breuer would echo each other, and I just want to read to you beginning of a moment when Breuer again expresses himself. Really the first lecture he gives since 1934 of any type comes in 1962, just as these buildings are being published. The American magazine Record had admired the, if we go back to that, or, yeah. They said, the Conference Assembly building at UNESCO is an extraordinary, imposing structure which looms larger than its size would suggest. And then and Breuer proclaims in Architectural Record that I consider this particular structure one of the masterpieces of our concrete age. The corrugated front wall and roof give a plastic definition of space to the Assembly Hall, which is entirely new in concept, completely correct structurally, and extremely exciting visually. So for years to come, Nervi and Breuer would echo one another, expressing in almost identical phrases their joint conviction that it was the role of a new synthesis of technology and art to carry the complete miracle of Gothic further. The miracle, as Nervi put it in engineering terms of, quote, and this is the Italian Nervi speaking, replacing the equilibrium achieved by masses of masonry with the equilibrium of forces created by the interplay of thrust and counter-thrust, of slender ribs built with very good materials. This is what he says in front of the students in the Charles Eliot Norton lecture in 1962. Breuer 1 year later gives a lecture at the engineering school at the University of Michigan, in which he added that the synthesis of architecture and sculpture, the fluid ways in which concrete both was made and in turn made manifest the play of structural forces, it can, this is Breuer, it being concrete can achieve this, he says. Matter and intrinsic form was the title of his lecture. Concrete, he says, reflects the stresses working in the structure with a photographic truthfulness. It seems almost an echo of Nervi's lecture in which he spoke of the need to, quote, to put the concrete where it works best. Now, one of the most extraordinary features of the collaboration, and the vital feature, as I said, which distinguishes the earthbound UNESCO from the sacred space of St. John's, was this decision to lift the folded plates into the air on a system of concrete piers that you've seen. So I think we're just going to move towards the very conclusion here because I want to leave some time for you to ask questions. Breuer would design some 19 buildings at St. John's in Minnesota in the years following, although none of them achieved the international acclaim of the Abbey Church and Monastery, which were celebrated in a series of exhibitions. Of these, the only one to pursue further, do we have it? Oh, this is a very interesting side note I want to bring in. Breuer, one text which I found in my research is Breuer writing on the nature of Egyptian architecture, and he writes about how the Egyptians, in fact, were able to reduce form to its essence for powerful expression, and how it would be important to bring the powerful expressiveness of Egyptian massiveness into modern engineering terms. So that's what he's doing in these series of buildings. Let's go forward. Here's some remarkable photographs of St. John's Abbey. There you can really, I think, see that a sense in which he's floating this engineering structure above glass planes, the front, and the overall complex there. I just want to show you one last building, which is this building, which you can just make out in the aerial shot across the plaza from the church itself, which is this library. We look on the outside, almost anonymous structure standing back from the church. Interesting use of these tile flue forms to create lighting, but inside the entire roof of this library held by a series on two of these enormous trees. Now this I think is clearly an homage to Nervi. This is Nervi's Palace of Labor in Turin, and just a few years later Breuer doing this in the library. We might have another view of that. Yeah, there Breuer. Let me juxtapose this with something Breuer told the engineering students at Michigan in 1963. Breuer looks at them and he says, buildings no longer rest on the ground. They are cantilevered from the ground up. The structure is no longer a pile, however ingenious and beautiful. It is very much like a tree, anchored by roots, growing up with cantilevered branches, possibly heavier at the top than at the bottom. He concluded with the new demands for an architecture in which sculptural form and its space-making capacities would lead to a fundamental reevaluation of the modern movement in architecture's earlier refusal of the symbolic dimension, which, as St. John's had told him, could not be separated from material realities. Here is Breuer once again. With the rebirth of solids next to glass walls, with supports which are substantial in material but not negligent in structural logic, a three-dimensional modulation of architecture is again in view, the brother or lover of our pure space. Although not resting on lions or acanthus leaves, space itself is again sculpture into which one enters. So I think that's our key takeaway here for Breuer. Space is, once again, sculpture into which one enters. So this is heavy lightness, this ability to combine the fascination of modernism's great open spaces, of luminosity, with a sculptural presence. So I'll just conclude with, I think, one of his very finest buildings, and one that I, in a sense, grew up with. Perhaps no building better exemplifies this newfound aesthetic of heavy lightness than the Whitney Museum of American Art, a commission that came in just in a few years after Breuer gave that lecture at Michigan. In June 1963, the museum trustees decided, after only 9 years in a new building that had been designed for them next to the Museum of Modern Art, that they wanted to get out of the shadow of that institution and their sometimes rival, and they wanted to establish a new presence in the heart of the gallery scene on Manhattan's Upper East Side. So in these years, all of the progressive galleries were along Madison Avenue. We're looking at the cars are here coming up Madison Avenue. The museum, just like the monks wanted to embrace a new liturgy, the museum wants to be where the artists are. They move uptown to this site, and they want also the museum to be a work of art, not simply a warehouse for art. After the trustees of the museum interviewed I.M. Pei, Louis Kahn, Paul Rudolph, Edward Larrabee Barnes, and Philip Johnson, they chose our Hungarian friend Marcel Breuer, or Breuer Marcel if you prefer, to create a building that could situate American art more prominently both on the grid of Manhattan and on the world map. Breuer, whose renown had been escalating along with his cultivation of an elemental monumentality since the joint commissions for the monastery and the UN, understood their challenges immediately and returned, according to Robert Gatchie's memoir of working with Breuer, after a weekend at home, he came back with this design, sketched on paper, for an inverted ziggurat clad in flame-treated gray marble to loom mysteriously over the corner of Madison Avenue and East 75th Street. So what I really want to call your attention to, because so many people see this building as a heavy, kind of almost neo-Egyptian monument, is once again not only, look at his playing with how he can create his own shadow lines to dramatize the cantilevering capacity, the mystery of what is the engineering that allows it to be possible for the largest floor. We're told that there's a big gallery space by that almost cyclopean window appearing there. There's where they had been in their modernist building, which was demolished some years later. They move uptown. There's Breuer's first sketch on the back of a letter he happened to have sitting on his desk at home, came back to the assistant and said, this is what we're going to build. We're going to set it off from the buildings on either side. We're going to create an exposed concrete wall you see on the very right-hand edge of the slide. We're almost going to create a frame for our building. We'll create the site, and then we'll float this building above it. Why do I say floated? It's very hard to photograph, but I think you can begin to make out that deep underneath, the lowest floor is not clad in granite, but is completely glazed, floor to ceiling glazed. These three inverted ziggurats hover above a glass wall. This wonderful photograph by the American architectural photographer. I think he was also of Hungarian origins, Ezra Stoller. Fascination at this period with the idea of the fundamental, the monumental, the Gideon is now talking about the beginnings of architecture. Look at this trip that is going to take us from the sidewalk across this very expressive bridge, across a moat, and then through a glass wall. Then we can even look back through that glass wall, which actually extends below the level of the street, back out to the street as though the city is being put on display, into this extraordinary lobby with its battalions, grid, of lighting that Breuer himself designed for that. There you see the loft-like spaces completely uninterrupted on any floor by walls, every floor getting larger as you go up, taller as you go up to the top floor. We're very interested in the left-hand section to the protruding window, which we see in this overexposed photograph. Let's go in at night, really dramatic. And there I think you can see, particularly at night when the lights are on, this effect of heavy lightness. Originally, Breuer had thought that that parapet wall itself would be glazed, but then in the end it was built of solid granite. One of the most beautiful experiences you can take. I sent my friend Tas here, I said, you've got to go see the staircase. You have to go through the building by the stair. This is almost the Bauhaus forecourse. Every texture, every material brought into a collage so that ultimately we can come out on each floor and discover it and ultimately see even how those windows stage a different experience of the city. No surprise. There's the top floor in one of the early installations. And no surprise that it was there that our master of heavy lightness chose to sit for one of his very last portraits, taken one of his very last official portraits. So I hope I've convinced you that we can trace that experiment from trying to float on air to the way he has actually floated, an extraordinarily complicated building for a museum of art above the sidewalk on East 75th Street in Manhattan. So also, I suppose the journey of an incredibly gifted and experimental Hungarian from Pécs via Weimar, Dessau, many other places, a brief visit back to Budapest, to become one of the leading world architects by the 1960s and 1970s in New York, looking very casual on that rather heavy chair, not of his own design. Okay, so thank you very much. If there's time for questions or comments, I would love to hear them.